This slideshow focuses on the Southwest region, which isn't at this point part of the United States, but eventually will become one, and at this time in history is owned by Spain. So the area that we're talking about that was Mexico, that was it's shown in this map in the green. Okay, so the green part was Mexico, and so that's really what we're talking about throughout this slideshow and kind of how Americans started to move in there and so how it started to develop. And so we'll start off with just Mexico itself. After 10 years of fighting, Spain, Mexico won their war and gained their independence from Spain. So in 1821, they became their own country, but they really, really struggled, kind of like America did, but America got it together a little bit quicker. They struggled to get a government together that was functional. They just couldn't find a government that everybody was happy with and that was established and was ready to go. And so while they're fighting over the government and fighting over how this country is going to work, their borderlands, the edge, this green area on this map started to be neglected. Places like California, New Mexico, and Texas. Because the main part of Mexico is still what Mexico is today down here, this orange part. But, the rest of it, this borderland that was kind of just stuck up there against the United States was neglected. It was left mostly uninhabited. There were not that many people that lived up there. And so these areas of Texas and New Mexico, they had problems as well as California, but really the big problems were that Texas and New Mexico were dealing with native attacks. There were natives coming in from the native territory, which was Oklahoma right here, okay, coming in and attacking, and people from the area coming in and attacking. The Apache and the Navajo were strongly opposed to those people being there, and so they attacked them often. Also, America was expanding into their territory, so they were taking little bits of land and claiming it, and Americans were moving in there, and the borders just were not set up really well, so America was expanding and taking some of their territory. Russia was expanding from the north and taking some of their territory. And as they're moving through these forts that were set up, started to become very weak, and it left all the frontier settlers, all the people that were Mexicans that were living on the edge, they became weak and vulnerable to attack from maybe these Russians that are coming in, maybe these Americans that are coming in, but definitely these natives who are coming in and attacking them. And so these were some of the big troubles that were happening in this area that were frustrating the people. And in this area at this time, the mission system was happening, and this was a very old Spanish system that had been set up. It was used by Spain back in the day to spread Christianity as well as the Spanish way of life, and so they'd set up these missions, and this is a picture of a mission here. And really, it's kind of like a church, but it's also like a fort that you can get protection in. And so what they would do is they'd have these missions, these forts, and they would control these big pieces of land where there were cows and sheep and horses that would graze, and they had the natives do all of the work. So the natives would come in and they do all the work, and it was basically slavery. And what they would do in return was they would teach them Christianity and convert them into that, and then teach them the Spanish ways of life. And so essentially, the Spanish thought that they were civilizing these people, and that was their payment for doing the work that they needed done. In 1834, Mexico decided that the missions were no longer going to be a religious thing and a private thing, and the missions were secularized. And so they were taken, what secularized means is taken away from the religious control and given to the government to control. And so the government didn't really want to control these, they didn't want to control these things, and so these big pieces of land, and so they found private people, right, just private ranchers, normal ranchers, who were allowed to own it, who were given these pieces of land, or sold these pieces of land, and they also relied on the natives for work, but at least they had to pay the natives for this work. So the mission system and the secularization of it really had a big impact on California, because it kind of opened up more land to be used for cattle ranching. And cattle ranching, raising cows, quickly excuse me, became the biggest part of the economy. It was huge. Okay. And so there were these people, these rancheros or ranchers, and they were predominantly white, mostly white. And them and their families only were about 10% of the entire society, but they had by far the most power because they were the ones that owned the land and made the money off of the land. Then there was a middle class, just slightly below these people, called the Mestizos, and those are mostly people with mixed European and Native ancestry. That's what the word means, mestizo. If you have one parent that's white and one parent that's Native, mix that up, and that is a mestizo. And so they were, that second group, and they were middle class, and they worked as either craftsmen, so that's just people that made or built things, or as vaqueros. Vaqueros were the cowboys who would go out and run the ranch for these people. And then at the bottom of society were the natives. Their situation did not improve at all from this secularization, or not very much. They went from basically slavery in the missions, but and they got out of that, but they were still exploited. They were expected to work a lot for very little pay, and so a lot of them escaped and just ran off and lived with the other California natives who were living in the area. In California, women had less rights than the men. The men were the only ones that could vote and all that kind of stuff. But the women did have more rights than a lot of American areas, so a lot of the areas in America, because they were at least allowed to own property, and allowed to sue other people as well. And they could still continue to own their own property even after they were married. It didn't automatically belong to their husband, as you saw in America at the time. Take a moment to write down the answer to checkpoint one. The next area we're going to talk about is New Mexico. New Mexico was kind of between Texas and California, which we just looked at. New Mexico did have a larger population than California because California had a very small population. But New Mexico was still very rural. There were not very many cities. Mostly it was just Santa Fe that was a major city. The main part of the economy in New Mexico was ranching as well, but it was sheep ranching. So instead of cows, they had sheep, and it was really, really beneficial for the sheep to be in that dry climate. They were able to survive, whereas the cattle would not be able to as easily. And so they were mostly, these ranches were established in the south area, south of the Santa Fe River, in the Rio Grande Valley, so in the nice land. And also the only kind of crops that they could grow were dry weather crops. So dry weather crops are things like corn, peppers, potatoes. These are the things that could be grown in the drier weather, and that's what they grew and ate primarily. In the 1820s, the Navajo and the Apache attacked, and when this happened, the people that were north of Santa Fe just got left out to fend for themselves. The government didn't have the resources or the wherewithal to go in and actually protect their people, and so people started to get very angry at the government. And so the Pueblo people and the Hispanic settlers from north of Santa Fe started a rebellion. They did a rebellion and they killed the territorial governor of the area as well as 16 other government officials. So everyone was very frustrated. You can see that the people of this area were very frustrated with the Mexican government and were looking for something else. So the Americans started to move into these borderlands, and really, they even before 1821, when Mexico got their independence, some people even started to move in. A few Americans moved into California before that point, and then as soon as they got their independence in 1821, the immigration really started to increase. And because of this immigration, because of these people being allowed to come in, really trade started to increase for Mexico. A lot of these countries that didn't want to trade with Spain, now that Mexico was their own country, they were happy to trade with them. And so the United States and Russia and others came to California and would trade away goods that the people needed and trade them for the furs and hides that these people that were living in California had good access to. All right. And so, like, hides like sea otters and seals and different things derived from cattle, all that kind of stuff. All right. And so in 1839, the governor of California was trying to get more settlers to come in. And so he gave 50,000 acres to John Sutter. John Sutter was an American man, okay, and he was given this big piece of land to become his ranch, and he created something that was later called, and here's a picture of it up here, okay, Sutter's Fort. Okay, and Sutter's Fort became this ranch and this trading post and became this very large place where people could come in and trade things. And it became what pretty much the first stop for anybody who was coming in new to California. They would stop there and trade and get the goods that they needed to be able to survive as they're setting up their homes, their new homes out in California. So more and more Americans began to arrive after this, and as they started to arrive, California and the rest of Mexico started to become very different places, and there was a lot of political issues between the people in this area and the national government in Mexico because they weren't giving those people what they wanted and what they needed. However, the amount of Americans there, only about 700. It wasn't very big, and so it's not like they could put up an entire war at this point. But this was kind of the start of the tension. As these Americans move in, they get frustrated with the way Mexico runs it, and then they start to fight back, whether it's politically or actually fighting. So if we look at other Americans that were in the area in Mexico, New Mexico as well as Texas, not a great title, but Texas as well. William Becknell is one of them. That's this man right here. William Becknell is an American trader who opened a trail from Santa Fe up to America. It's this major trade route from Missouri, which was easy to get to in America, all the way to Santa Fe. And that allowed these Americans to come in and trade their goods to this country, to Mexican people for silver, for mules, for furs, for the resources that they wanted from Mexico. And so he opened the Santa Fe Trail, and that's what he's most famous for. And then in Texas, bad things were happening as well. Texas was this buffer, this piece of land between Mexico and the United States, but not very many people lived there. Okay, there were Tejanos there. There were Spanish-speaking Mexican people who lived there in Texas. They were called Tejanos, and they settled mostly in the two cities of San Antonio and Goliad. Right, everything else was just kind of empty out there, and it was really hard to defend anybody who was there because the natives were there, and it was empty, and they didn't have forts, all that kind of stuff. It was just really kind of a difficult place to take care of. And so Mexico decided, in order to get it settled, to get population there and calm it down a little bit, they were going to allow foreign people to settle there. And when they did that, the Americans started to rush in, and problems came out of that. And the next thing that we talk about in the next lecture will be all about the issues that happened between the people of Texas and their government in Mexico. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far, and if you don't have any, then just make 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test.